Our next talk is from John Pottle, and John is the director of Royal Institute of Navigation, and he will be speaking at Secure Southwest as well. But this will give you a little bit of a flavour of more about the institute itself and a little bit about what they do, and a few hints perhaps as to what that talk will be at Secure Southwest. So, John, over to you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. I've got quite an affinity for the Southwest, having lived there for about 15 of the last 20 years. And in fact, at the end of the day today, we'll be hopping in the car and heading down to Newton Abbot, where our daughter lives. So, very fond of the Southwest, and hope I can spend a bit more time there. Who knows? So an introduction to navigation cybersecurity is the topic today. And I hope I've pitched it so that it'll have something for everybody. We're all doing it, aren't we? I think pretty much everybody is using navigation in some way or other, positioning or navigation somewhere or other in their life. On the left, of course, driving a car, walking around. On the right-hand side, it's just an example of a logistics tracking application. And you could argue that we're doing it a bit too much. People are more engaged with their devices than they are with perhaps the world around them. So, what about navigation and cybersecurity? Well, normally when people start thinking about a navigation system and what do you need from it, the most common answer is accuracy. I really need an accurate position. And it's actually very hard to achieve. And this is just a simple example, but it is a real one on the left-hand side. This is a static receiver, actually tracking two systems, GPS and GLONASS, the Russian system, over 3,000 or so fixes. And the position's all over the place. Errors between a few meters and up to 30 meters, average errors of 11 meters. So I would suggest that accuracy is only one aspect of a performance of a navigation system. And in the context of this talk in particular, this discussion here, there are other ways to think about navigation performance definition. Accuracy being one, availability, the percentage of time a position is available to the system or to the user. Continuity, the probability that the system performance will be maintained as stated to the required accuracy without interruption. And perhaps most pertinently for this discussion, integrity. So some indication of trust. And if there's a degradation or a potential question over the accuracy or the performance, getting a timely warning. And it's not just positioning. So we talk about PNT. You may have heard that abbreviation, PNT, positioning, navigation, and timing. And it really is so widely used, often derived from satellite navigation systems. Sometimes it's called the fifth utility. I've heard people even say, PNT is just like the air we breathe; it's everywhere, and we would really miss it if we were without it. I mean, to bring that to life a little bit across the critical national infrastructure segments, if you think about what would happen if there was a problem with positioning from satellite navigation, you can quickly come up with quite a list. For example, emergency services there at the top. Well, they all respond based on position information, which is often coming from a GPS or GNSS receiver. Logistics, think about food delivery. There are vans driving around here, and I'm sure where you are, all the time delivering food and all sorts of things. Transport disruptions, kind of obvious, but also information systems and logistics heavily rely on position, navigation, timing. And as I said, it's not just the positioning. So a lot of infrastructure relies on the precise timing that you can achieve using a very low cost GPS or multi-GNSS, multi-system receiver. And it's super accurate. I mean, it's timing to a few nanoseconds anywhere for nothing, which is extraordinary. And it's been adopted very widely. So, you know, comms and broadcast networks really use it a lot. And there are holdover systems and backups and so on, but there's still a vulnerability there. In fact, there was an example a couple of years ago where the New York wireless network crashed because of a 1 second leap second insert in GPS. And even things like ATMs, cash machines. There was an incident in San Diego a few years back where a military vessel came back into San Diego having forgotten to turn off its GPS jammer that they were doing trials out in the Pacific. And all the cash machines in San Diego stopped working for a period of time until they figured out what was happening. So it's absolutely everywhere is the point I wanted to make. So to understand the vulnerabilities and just start to talk about the security, if you like, of a solution, I just want to go through a few high-level basics. So first one is, where are these satellites? And this is a jolly complex but fascinating diagram, and I'll just skim the surface of it. So if you start on the outer ring, geostationary Earth orbit, 36,000 kilometers above the equator is the Clark Belt, or the geostationary arc. And that's where all of our navigation satellites, all of our communications satellites are, or that's an old-fashioned statement now. It's where our traditional communications satellites are. So satellite dishes on the sides of people's houses all point to communications satellites on the geostationary arc. And the beauty of that is they stay in the same position as the Earth rotates. If you go right in closer to the Earth, and by the way, this is approximately to scale, this diagram. If you go right in closer to the surface of the Earth, you're in the LEO arc, the low Earth orbit arc. And that's, you know, in round figures, 500 to 1,000, just over 1,000 kilometers up. And that's where Elon Musk, for example, has got his satellites. It's where OneWeb is, the system that we're all, to a greater or lesser extent, shareholders in through the tax payer investment that the government made a few years ago. Quite controversial, but that's where OneWeb satellites are, International Space Station, etc. So the GPS satellites, along with the other navigation systems, Galileo, Compass, and GLONASS, Galileo being the European and Compass the Chinese system, sometimes called Beidou, they're in medium Earth orbit. And you can see they're at different altitudes, and but fundamentally they're all in the medium Earth orbit. And in very round figures, they orbit the Earth once every 12 hours, which, if you translate that into practical terms, means they're moving jolly fast. So the movement of a receiver on the surface of the Earth is always, for all practical purposes, always going to be much, much slower than the speed of the satellites. So movement of the receiver is not really a particular vulnerability when it comes to tracking these satellites. So that's where they are. Just take that away. They're moving very fast. Because they're quite a long way away. They transmit at reasonable power, but when it reaches the surface of the Earth, the power of these signals is extremely low. And I like this diagram. This is not a technical talk, but this diagram just illustrates a little bit of how low they actually are. So you can see all sorts of signals here, and you can possibly start to think about what they are. If you look at number 10, for example, it's frequency along the bottom from low to high. 10 is 2.4 gigs. Well, I'm sure you're all aware 2.4 gigs is one of the key Wi-Fi frequencies. And that cluster there are some Wi-Fi signals. Number 6 and number 8, for example, are GSM, 3G mobile. Number 7 in the middle there, if you go down, that's actually Iridium, which is a low Earth orbit satellite system. And you can see it's quite low power level already. Question is, of course, where are the GPS and other GNSS global navigation satellite system signals? Well, the answer is they're buried in the noise. And the GPS uses special techniques to bring those signals out of the noise so you can track. But that's very vulnerable to interference and other RF radiation. The signal itself is made up of different aspects: a carrier signal, a code, and a nav message. I won't go into detail on that at all. But what I do want to say is that the technical details on those are published in the public domain. There's a link. And that's another source of vulnerability. There, for civil signals, there's no encryption. And there's just a bit of authentication coming in on the Galileo signal. But fundamentally, there's no authentication either. So if you wrap all that up, fast moving, low power, no authentication, no security on the signals, there are quite a number of vulnerabilities to be aware of. Some of them are man-made, such as multipath. Incidentally, that moving around on the earlier image I showed of the the aerial shot of 3,000 fixes, most of that error is multipath, because the satellites are moving and signals are bouncing around and you're getting extended path lengths. That's mostly multipath error. You've probably heard of spoofing and jamming. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Atmosphere is actually quite a big issue, particularly at high sunspot, high solar activity, and around the equator. And bottom left, good old human error. It happens. And then on the right-hand side, well, think of a receiver. It's giving you a position, but it's only valuable if it's connected via some sort of interface or API or comms link to a system. And that's a vulnerability for non-RF attacks. So there's a whole basket of things to think about. I said I'd talk a tiny bit more about jamming. I love this chart. I think Guy Binell, who's also on the call, this may be your chart, Guy. But there are plenty of devices you can just go online and buy. I think it's true to say that I might have bought one from Amazon in the past. And it's legal to own them, but it's illegal to use them, at least unless it's in a screened environment. But luckily on this website, bottom right, you can, if you buy one, you can get one free. And you can also have this rather attractive looking, sort of rifle-like thing as an anti-drone device. But seriously, they are available and they do get used. This project, you can look into detail if you want, Strike 3, was where interference detectors were put around the UK and indeed in other countries. And the summary is that if you had one of these detectors at a key intersection on a road network or a port or an airport, for example, in the UK, you would see multiple instances of interference that could potentially affect GPS every day. Certainly around ports, it's pretty reasonable to expect a couple of hundred incidents a day. And of those, a proportion will definitely affect the performance of the navigation system. So it's out there. Spoofing, you've probably heard of, which is sending false signals to trick your receiver to lock on to something other than the satellites. And as I mentioned, that's helped by the open service specification. And I mean, the quick Google will give you all sorts of resources online that if you fancy having a go at this, it's amazing how many views there are. This particular video, bottom right, is a chap who's using some open source software to make his device think it's in Kansas when he's actually in the UK. And he's had about 100 times more views on his video than I have on my one, which was GPS Basics. So it's out there. The actors are all sorts of actors. This is actually a very interesting one of Shanghai, where if you follow the yellow line, a ship's coming up, and as the ship approaches this particular location, the GPS location jumps to a ring of positions, which is clearly not on the water. But the ship wasn't on the land. And in fact, all of these ships indicated by the red and the yellows and so on were not on the land. And the anomaly appears to affect vessels once they're just a couple of kilometers away. And once they are affected by presumably jamming and or spoofing, nobody, to my knowledge, has found out what caused this. They start to randomly show their position falsely around this ring, and there are loads of examples like that in the Baltic, around Finland. Gas pipeline events have also coincided with incidences reported of upsets and interference to GPS. So it's there are actors at all levels, from casual hackers right up to state actors. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And well, what can you do about it? It's a big topic, but just to touch the surface, there are all sorts of approaches. The one that we've zoned in on more than any other on the RIN is this type of logic. So define your requirements, evaluate your risks against potential threats, and then consider a system approach that will give you the level of performance that you require. System requirements is a talk in its own right, really, but it's a layered approach covering system, user element, system level, and element level. What operating system, what power, what interface, etc. You can see, diagrammatically that those 4 arrows are just a tiny corner of defining the system requirements. And then there are some tools. There's no standard for assessing risk, but there are some tools out there. This is one we use in the RIN to quantitatively assess vulnerability. Risk is likelihood times severity at the most basic level. And there's an Excel tool that we've used and people have found it useful. And then in terms of mitigations, what do you do about this once you've assessed your risks? Well, there are an awful lot of options, but the headline is, if your application has got some safety or commercially critical aspect to it, or it's critical infrastructure, then do not, under any circumstances, just rely on the navigation from space. Think about a system of systems, integrating different ranging sources together. And there are many, as you can see from this diagram. If I bring that to a bit more sort of simple, graspable reality in the couple of minutes I've got, our cell phones, our devices have got satellite navigation. They've got Wi-Fi positioning. They've got cellular positioning. They've got positioning indications from Bluetooth, and increasingly other sensors as well. Inertial sensors are always used, and they're being used in a more sophisticated way, but also microphones and near field comms. Using the camera is becoming much more common, and also low Earth orbit satellites. So just to wrap up, here's a little experiment that you can do if you want to kind of get to grips with this system of system approach in your cell phone. A very simple little play around you can do yourself, and you'll see it working in action. So here's a screenshot of the blue dot. First thing to say is that the little circle around the blue dot does have significance. So it's true to say that the fix on the left, where you can just see that little hazy blue around the blue dot, is the phone's got slightly less confidence than the one on the right. The one on the right is a high confidence satellite navigation fix. If you then go to a place where there is no satellite navigation, in this particular example, I was actually in a hotel which was made of concrete with metal reinforcement, and it was pretty easy just to go into the building. And GPS and other satellite signals were denied. And you can see that blue dot's just sprung out. And if you try this somewhere where you don't get GPS, you'll see it too. So this is Wi-Fi positioning. Accuracy of current Wi-Fi positioning, maybe 10, 20, 40, 50 meters, something like that. It is improving with new techniques, which maybe I can touch on in the next talk. But that's what you're seeing there. And then if you turn off the Wi-Fi and still stay somewhere where there's no GPS, you'll probably see the blue dot will just go right out like this. And what you're seeing there is cellular positioning. So that's, in round figures, a few hundred meters, maybe half a kilometer of confidence in the position. To go back to that accuracy, availability, continuity, and integrity, you can immediately see that this device has been optimized not for accuracy. And that's really important. So our mobile devices are not optimized for accuracy. They'll take accuracy when they can get it, but they're actually optimized for continuity, so that when the apps ping the phone for a location, they get it, whatever, so that the user gets a good experience. And you can try that. It's a very simple experiment. Is the government doing anything about this? Yes, more slowly than the RIN would like, than we would like in the RIN, but I'm optimistic that after various reports, each of which you can Google at leisure, and they're in the public domain, we've been involved with all of them, there is a recognition that this is a serious issue and needs to be addressed. And I believe there will be a proper strategy and associated standing office in government to address the risk to critical infrastructure from a loss of satellite navigation. I hope that'll happen later this year. I don't want to disappoint you, Jeff. I'm not going to talk about the RIN too much, but you can always visit our website. We do all sorts of good stuff. And I've also included a number of links and resources, which I would commend to you. There's a lot of information out there, some of it from the RIN and some of it just more generally available. That's me. Thank you very much indeed.